Chapter 20, The Age of Ideologies. In other words, Europe in the aftermath of revolution. The time frame we're going to cover is, 1815 to 1848. Got a frog in my throat. Before we get into it, let me give you a real quick summary. The first half of the 19th century, I guess you could say it was characterized by a number of themes, if you would, like revolution and conservatism and liberalism and nationalism. And each of the themes, well, it had its beginning back in the last quarter of the 18th century, or the 1700s. But the event that, well, shall we say, inspired them most was, of course, the French Revolution. And that revolution impacted continental Europe for several reasons, and in several different ways. And although the wave of ideas of revolution flooded Europe consciousness, and everybody was thinking about fraternity and equality and liberty, but it's going to be Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars that really forced the European monarchs to start making some serious decisions about how to respond to this series and waves of revolution and the demand for reform. Certainly no European monarch would ever support the revolutionaries, but reform, well, that was a different story. How could the governments in Europe deal with reform? And how did the era of the dual revolutions modify and transform European governments into European politics? Now, the first slide of this is going to be about the people who were at the Vienna Congress, or Congress of Vienna. And this was held, of course, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and the main purpose was to try to stop any more revolutions from starting. Because the European monarchs got together and they decided they did not want to become another France where every time you turned around there was a revolution. There's a lot of changes going on, especially in economics. So the idea was to maintain a sort of European balance of power that's going to keep any one country from becoming too powerful and to keep France in check. Of course, the problems that they solved at Vienna was going to emerge again at the end of the 19th century. Then all of a sudden, it's not France we have to be worried about, but a unified Germany and the European imperialistic ambitions that she had. It's going to be a second industrial revolution. And what about the presumed duties of the great powers? It's going to lead to new conflicts across the globe. Well, at the Congress, let's take a look and see who was there. From Russia, Alexander I was considered himself an enlightened monarch, but he was an absolutist. He wanted to see himself as the liberator of Europe. Well, that didn't happen. From France, we had Prince Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. Now, he had escaped being executed during the Terror by, shall we say, exiling himself to the United States. Yes, he served under Napoleon, and he was a foreign minister to Louis XVII. From Austria, we had Clement von Metternich, the architect of the peace. This gentleman was a conservative. He was a lifelong hatred of any kind of change, especially political change. From England, we had the foreign minister, Robert Castlereagh. Now, he was the principal organizer in the expedition for the Peninsula Campaign. So this concert of Europe was principally his own ideas and creation. And from Prussia, we had Karl August, Count von Hindenburg, prime minister. Now, he had organized an alliance with Russia back in 1812, which really led to Napoleon's downfall. He also helped organize the solution to what we call the Polish question during this Congress. So you've got all these important leaders there. And they're just trying to figure out what to do because they don't want France to rear her ugly head and have another revolution, which she will have, but not if they can stop it. So the goals were the restoration of order and legitimate authority. We're going to recognize Louis XVIII as the legitimate sovereign of France. And we're going to restore good French bloodline people, Bourbon leaders in Spain and the two Sicilies, because they had been, of course, previously occupied by relatives of Napoleon. We're going to prevent France from any further growth. We're going to restore the Netherlands. As far as Germany and Poland, well, the Conference of the Rhine, the independent states of Bavaria, Wittenberg, and Saxony were recognized. A part of Poland was going to be recognized as being a little bit independent, but she was going to still be under the care and control of Russia. But large parts of the Polish territory were actually given to Austria and Prussia for their share of the war. British compensations, well, she got some French territories that had been occupied in South Africa, and Prussia. The Concert of Europe, when they all got together, securing the peace and creating permanent stability. Oh, wow, a beautiful dream. British, Austria, Prussia, and Russia formed a quadruple alliance, and then when France joined in 1818, it became the quintuple alliance. The cooperation and the suppression of all disturbances to the peace of Europe. That sounds like something that's going to happen a few years later when they try to outlaw war. Yeah, it's a great idea, but how are you going to enforce it? They were going to establish a ruler legitimately based on international treaties and not his conceived divine right. It's just showing you the different changes of some of the borders, which you don't need to know. Now, see, there aren't just revolutions going on in Europe. This is a real cute little film. It's not cute. It's an informative YouTube presentation from the Khan University about the revolutions that are going on in South America. They put it very well, and they even have some nice maps. Oh, come on. Well, I guess we have to start having you guys make a sandwich before I try to bring a film up, because it looks like it's going to take about 2 minutes. And I think that is asinine. But my little dot's moving, so it's doing something. At last.
This is a map of what the Americas look like at around the year 1750. And as you can see, it was for the most part divided as colonies by a bunch of European powers. Most prominent is Spain. You can see in this peach brownish color. It had control all the way as south as modern-day Chile and Argentina, and all the way as far north as modern-day Texas and California. You also see significant control by the Portuguese in what will eventually be Brazil. The French have, at this point, some territory, especially in North America and in several islands in the Caribbean. And the British, of course, have control along the east coast of North America. And they also have several islands in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. As we fast forward 100 years, we're going to see a dramatic change. Notice, roughly 100 years later, most of what used to be these European colonies have now achieved independence. In other videos, we go in some depth from 1776 to 1783. You have the American War for Independence. You see on this map now, the United States is an independent country. From 1791 to 1804, you have Toussaint Louverture lead the revolt against French control, eventually gaining independence and establishing Haiti. From 1807 to 1830, you have a series of revolutions in Latin America, many of which were led by Simón Bolívar, who was a criollo, or Creole, Venezuelan. The term Creole has many meanings in modern-day language, but in this context, it refers to someone of mostly Spanish descent who was born in the New World. And Simón Bolívar plays an active role in achieving independence from Spain for Venezuela, what will eventually be Colombia and Panama, Ecuador, Peru, and the country that will eventually be named for him, Bolivia. So there is an interesting question here. What led to all of these revolutions? The map that I showed you before, that colonial map of the Americas, these colonies had been in place for several hundred years before these revolutions. Why did all of these revolutions happen roughly at the same time? Well, one overarching idea is that as we enter into the 1700s, you have the intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. There were many authors and many publications involved in the Enlightenment, but perhaps most famous is the Encyclopédie, in French, or encyclopedia, which had the intent of collecting much of the scientific and political science knowledge of the time. And it's considered one of the central texts of the Enlightenment, and it was a series of articles published from the 1750s all the way until the 1770s. And to get a sense of it, here is an excerpt of an article by one of the authors, Denis Diderot, considered one of the primary actors in the Enlightenment. No man has received from nature the right to command others. Liberty is a gift from heaven, and each individual of the same species has the right to enjoy it as soon as he enjoys the use of reason. And so when we get into the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson, he borrows heavily from these ideas of the Enlightenment. Now, the Haitian Revolution was partially inspired by these ideas of the Enlightenment, but they were also helped by the fact that France was undergoing its own revolution at the time, and it was not in the position to exert strong control over a far-flung colony. The French Revolution lasts from 1789 to 1799, at which point Napoleon Bonaparte takes control of France and starts the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon tries to keep control, what would eventually be Haiti, was an incredibly valuable resource. It produced a good chunk of coffee and sugar in the world. It was incredibly profitable for the plantation owners and for France as a nation. But between the ideas of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, the slaves of Haiti, led initially by Toussaint Louverture, were able to overthrow and set up their own nation, which is the first time that this has happened from a successful slave revolt. This is a map of the empire that Napoleon establishes at its peak, and as you can see, you see France, but he's able to take over much of modern-day Germany, Italy. He goes to war with Portugal and then eventually Spain as well, both significant colonial powers in South America. So it's in this context. You have the Enlightenment as we get into the 1700s. You already have the example of the American War for Independence, 13 colonies being able to declare independence from one of the largest powers at the time. Then a successful slave revolt to establish their own country against another significant power. And once Spain and Portugal are fighting Napoleon, coupled with the ideas of the Enlightenment and the examples of the United States and Haiti, it inspires a whole other series of revolts in Latin America, many of which were led by Simón Bolívar. And so by the time we get to 1850, much of the European imperialism in the Americas has come to an end.
Now, just a little bit more. The unsteady foundations of the colonial rule from Europe was a lot of the problem that was caused. Argentina declared her independence in 1816. San Martin marches from Argentina to the liberation of Chile and Peru. Meanwhile, Simón Bolívar led uprisings from Venezuela across to Bolivia, and he and Mr. San Martin get together and presented an formidable force. So these political revolts were unleashing conflict and civil war all over the place. Now, some of the elites or better off, or landowners, wanted just liberation from Spain. They wanted Spain off their back. But you had a group of radicals who just wanted land reform, that they wanted an end to slavery. Two very wonderful ideas. They also wanted to repress all the other radical movements except theirs. But the United States and Britain, they both got together and they wanted to protect these new nations. So the USA issued something called the Monroe Doctrine, and the story behind that is really quite the thing. The British representative got together with the representative in Kentucky, not in Kentucky, but the representative in Washington, D.C., who happened to be a senator from Kentucky who was serving as a vice president, and he said, you know, this is wonderful, but if the British minister goes back to England and gets everything okayed, it's just going to be known as an English proclamation instead of an American proclamation. So they went ahead and issued everybody, no more new colonies are going to be formed in the South and Central America by Europe. If you're there now, you can stay, but you're not going to get any new ones. And they're going to call it the Monroe Doctrine because our president at the time was President Monroe. And we had no Navy at the time, so we were going to have to depend on the British Navy to do the enforcing of this. But Britain was eager to create new trading partners, so she didn't object. Meanwhile, revolution hits Mexico. Begins in 1810 with Father Hidalgo, and within a year, well, it took 11 years, it finally declared independence. And then Brazil declared independence in 1823, so it all went rather fast. I don't know. This shouldn't be. If it's what I think it is, it's got a wrong title. Let's see. I hope it's not a duplicate. Sometimes I enjoy something so much I forget and put it back in again, but this is not supposed to be here, if it's what I think it is. Just bear with me and we'll see. So if you got a sandwich, go ahead and eat it, I guess, huh? It may be the same one. It was from Conn University. We know it's the same one. I'm sorry, folks. I put it in twice. Well, so much for that. I'm going the wrong way. New nations of Latin America. Yep. But it's not just happening in Central and South America and Europe. It's also happening in Russia. When Tsar Alexander I died, a group of people, mostly nobles and high members of the army and the elitist people up there, got together and they wanted to see Russia as a liberator of Europe. They called themselves a Decembrist. And they said, Russia needs reform. We need to eradicate serfdom. We need to curb the Tsar's power. Well, Nicholas I, who had come to power when his father had died, he said, no, it didn't take him long to crush this revolt that was kind of like a tempest in a teapot. Because he was going to rule Europe's most uncompromising, oh, I got my tongue screwed around. He was going to rule as Europe's most uncompromising conservative. In other words, he didn't like change and he was never going to change. But there were some signs of change that did come about. Very few. The bureaucracy became a little bit more centralized and because of it, a little bit more efficient. A little bit, I'm stressing. They codified all the legal system. That's always a good idea. Get things written down and get them, so you haven't got 2 or 3 different things going in different directions. And the landowners started doing something that the English had done similar to the Enclosure Act. They started reorganizing their estates to become more productive. And they did, but it helped them, but not the serfs. Meanwhile, we've got revolts in Greek and Serbia. Now, the Greek War for Independence happened from 1821 and 1827, lasting 6 years. Now, of course, they felt like that they were part of Europe, and they had a European identity, and they had the sympathy of most of Europe. But the whole idea was they cast it as a rebellion, as a war between Christianity and Islam. It was a crusade for liberty, a crusade to preserve the classical Greek heritage. Of course, they were celebrating the Greek heritage and demonizing the Turkish heritage. British, French, and Russian troops went in against the Turks. And the London Protocols that were established after the war established Greek independence in 1830. Well, we had I'll show you this picture here just in a few minutes. There was also something going on in Serbia. Because Russia's supporting Serbia, mainly because she's real close to the Black Sea. And a revolt and semi-independence. She helps you, but she never totally lets go either. So Serbian became an Orthodox Christian principality, protected, and I say protected very lightly, by Russia. So the European opportunism was to weaken the Ottoman Empire. And Greece and Serbia did not break commercial ties with them. They still traded with them. There is this picture called the Massacre at Chinos. It's a picture of what had supposedly happened during the Greek rebellion. Uh, it's a killing of 10,000s of Greeks on the island of Chios by the Ottoman troops during the Greek War of Independence. These people had gone to the island to try to protect themselves, and the Ottoman soldiers massacred tens of thousands of them. This is a picture of a painting. It's by a French artist. I think his name is Eugene Delacroix, I believe. This work is really huge. It's hanging in the Louvre Museum in Paris. It's supposed to demonstrate the horror and destructiveness on the island of Chino, and that's why it's called the Chinos Massacre. Guess what? 1830, and France is at it again. Charles X pushed the assembly to compensate his nobles for land lost during the Napoleonic Wars. Now, he did restore the Catholic Church to its rightful place in the French schools, but his efforts to please the royalists met with opposition. Now, the royals are people who want a different king, really, and Charles calls for new elections. Then he dissolved the newly elected assembly because he didn't like who was elected. He began to restrict the suffrage movement, and he announced very strict press censorship. Well, guess what? The people didn't like this. The artisans, the workers, and the students went on a 3-day uprising, and the troops refused to fire on them. So Charles X had to say bye-bye. So Louis Philippe became the king. It's called the July Monarchy. It's going to be a constitutional monarchy. And he doubled the number of eligible voters to, although voting was a privilege, it was not something you automatically gained because you were a member of the French society. But the major winners of the 1830 revolution were the property class. What a surprise. Meanwhile, the Belgian leaders were never happy with being included in the Kingdom of Netherlands. So the French July 1830 revolution kind of galvanized them to do something about it. So after the Dutch troops were forced to withdraw from Brussels, the major European powers led by Great Britain went in and guaranteed the independence. And Belgium was going to remain independent and neutral until 1814 with the First World War. In Poland, well, they didn't like the Russian Tsar's brother Constantine being in charge, and he was pretty mean, pretty hard. So the revolutionaries in Poland drove him out. Well, they also got a few ideas from this French Revolution again, and they thought, let's revolt. But after occupying Warsaw, the major European powers which had stayed neutral decided to continue to stay neutral, and as soon as they were declared their neutrality and started pulling out, Russian troops came in, crushed the little revolt, and put Poland under military rule. So I guess some places it doesn't pay to be revolting, does it? Now, the reform in Great Britain. Well, why does Great Britain need reforms? I thought they were pretty democratic, right? Well, in 1832, they passed what's called the Great Reform Bill, and it reallocated 143 parliamentary seats from the rural South to the industrial North. Okay. It expanded the franchise, and the political strength of the landed aristocrat interests were going to remain because most of the people in the industrial North were wealthy and had money. Well, the liberal reforms, the Whigs, the industrial middle classes, and radical artisans said, no, that's not really a reform. We want reform. And wanted to enfranchise all responsible citizens. So the Corn Laws were repealed after 1846, and a free trade law was passed. Parliament abolished slavery in the colonies in 1838. Well, that's good. But the British radicalism and the Chartist movement. Now, the Chartist movement it's called the People's Charter. It's a reform petition because the people, especially in the South, they're not satisfied with this Great Reform Bill. They demanded universal white male suffrage. They wanted a secret ballot. They wanted an end to property qualifications as a condition of public office. We should have annual parliamentary elections. We should get new elections every year. And the people who are houses of common members should be paid. We should have equal electoral districts. Now, these are not unreasonable demands, but they presented it to Parliament, and it was, of course, denied. And they presented it again in 1842, and again it was denied. So the supporters decided instead of just being passive, we're going to do active efforts, and we're going to have strikes, and we're going to have meetings. On April 1848, 25,000 workers marched to Parliament with a petition signed by 6 million Britons. It was rejected. But the seeds of reform were planted. Now this little film, and it's not a repeat, it's not a duplication, this is going to be one of giving you a little bit more information about the Chartist movement. Maybe you'll understand it a little bit better. I'm getting so I hate moving dots.
Well, here I am outside the Palace of Westminster, the seat of Parliament since the 13th century, and if you like, the focus of this entire story. And as I've explained, Parliament in the early industrial period was unrepresentative of any but a small fraction of the population, basically just the landowning elite. But in the 1830s, two dramatic events shook Westminster. The first was a massive fire that destroyed almost the entire building, not important to our story, but a symbol that change could occur even here. And the second was a piece of legislation, a law pushed through Parliament. And it's vital to understand this act if we're to understand the anger that rippled across Britain in the late 1830s. And this crucial piece of legislation was the Great Reform Act of 1832. Now you read old-fashioned history books of 19th century Britain, and you'll find the Great Reform Act hailed as a triumph, a milestone on the onward march to democracy. And it's true, certainly, it made Parliament more representative. It gave MPs to the new industrial towns. It doubled the number of voters. And yet it caused such anger. Why? Well, to be honest, I don't think it was a great Reform Act at all. I think it was a nasty, small-minded, hypocritical little Reform Act. Because, and here's the point, the MPs that passed this act, they weren't interested in increasing democracy in this country. They were trying to block democracy. They thought, if we give the vote to a few more people, all of whom, like us, have property, if we give the vote to cozy middle-class folk, to industrialists, to factory owners, to bankers, to shopkeepers, then they'll help us keep the vote out of the hands of everyone else, the rabble, the swinish multitude. 1832 was the moment in British history when the propertied classes in the countryside and the propertied classes in the towns joined forces, closing ranks against the poor, the labourers in the countryside and the workers in the towns. The Reform Act was met with celebration amongst the middle classes, those with the tidy sum of £10 a year who now could vote. But the act confirmed to the workers their powerlessness. And out of that disappointment was born a new political movement, the Chartist movement, the greatest expression yet of the people's demand for political change. It began peacefully. Signatures were collected for a petition, the Great Charter. It listed their demands: votes for all, secret ballots, regular parliaments, payment of MPs, all rights we take now for granted, the building blocks of our democracy. But when the Charter was brought to Westminster in 1839, it was laughed out of Parliament. And so the tide began to turn. And a new slogan was heard here in the mills and the factories: peaceably if we can, forcibly if we must. There were rumours of muskets stockpiled and of local blacksmiths mass-producing weapons. And from about October 1839, we read these first tantalising accounts from police records of workers at the end of the factory day foot-slogging it up onto the moors there to drill for the revolution that must now surely come. But it never did. It's strange, you know. In France, there were revolutions not just in 1789, but in 1830, in 1848, in 1870. All that violent upheaval. But here, the revolution never came. Some historians, reflecting on that contrast between France and Britain, have concluded maybe we Brits were just too quiet, too uncomplaining. Was that how it was? Well, I don't think so. The thousands of men who mobilized up here on the moors were hardly quiet and uncomplaining. But when that bubbling anger spilled into actual confrontation in Newport, in Sheffield, in Bradford, these riots were crushed almost before they'd begun. The fact is that the Chartist movement was riddled with police informers, police spies. And when the riots began, the authorities were ready. The militias moved in, arrests were made. The Chartist leaders were broken with years of hard labor in prison. The last time the Chartists met was on Kennington Common in London on a rainy day in 1848. It was all rather sad. There were apparently more spectators than demonstrators. The police barred the Chartists from marching on Parliament, and the demonstrators all went home. I think at that moment they must have despaired that the vote would never be won, but it was, in the most unlikely way.
This is just, it's called a Great Charity Ball, but it's not really a ball. It's people get together to try to raise money for the Chartist movement. They had to give it some kind of name other than being political. So what about slavery after 1815? Slavery, Enlightenment, and the Revolution. When you get right down to it, slavery, the act of slavery, contradicts natural law and natural freedom. Now, the Virginia planters in the United States refused to be slaves to the British king, but they continue to own slaves. The French revolutionaries were denouncing a king who would enslave them, yet slavery remained intact in the French colonial islands in the Caribbean, even after the French Revolution. In England, abolitionist William Wilberforce, who was a member of Parliament, presented a petition to Parliament to ban the slave trade. And the Atlantic slave trade was banned in 1808. But for 40 years after that, more than 2.5 million slaves were brought to the markets in the Americas on English ships. Adam Smith, a Scottish economist, argued that free labor, like free trade, was much more efficient. And the religious revivals in the United States and England energized the abolitionist movement. Former slave trader Reverend John Newton wrote the hymn Amazing Grace to describe his conversion experience and salvation. It even became acceptable for allowing women to participate in the abolitionist movement. And anti-slavery petitions were signed by the millions in 1820s and 1830s in Europe as well as in the Americas. Of course, there were slave rebellions in Haiti. There was also slave rebellions in Virginia and Louisiana, South Carolina, Barbados, and Jamaica. The only one that was really successful was the one in Haiti. 1838, Great Britain actually emancipated 800,000 slaves in her colonies. 10 years later, the French revolutionaries emancipated slaves in all their French colonies. And of course, all the new nations, once they had the revolutions in Latin and Central America, eliminated slavery, because most of the population was down there was black anyway. So new ideologies in politics, yeah. With some issues raised by the French Revolution, like the development of ideologies, or isms, as we say, led to political thought, even for the common folk. And changes brought on by the Industrial Revolution brought about questions of equality and rights. So the concept of legitimacy as a general anti-revolutionary policy, that seems to be just fine. The monarchy was a guarantor of political stability, and nobility seemed as rightful leaders of the nation. That's if you're a conservative. Changes must be slow, incremental, and managed by people who know what's going on, such as the nobility. And constitutions were viewed with skepticism because it was seen as being too vague. So what were conservative leaders like? Well, take Edmund Burke. He wrote Reflections on the Revolution in France. He was opposed to the common people. He believed that you need to have a strong monarch to have stability. He didn't like any of this talk about natural rights, and you need to show deference to experience, tradition, and history. Joseph de Maistre and Louis Gabriel Ambrose Bonaparte, they defended absolute monarchy and the Catholic Church. So here you go again. These people are not really conservative. They just don't want change. The monarchy, aristocracy, and the church were mainstays of the social and political order. They felt like that if you didn't have those strong bonds there, you would not have stability. But the commitment to individual liberties and rights was one of the most important tenets of liberalism. They said the most important function of government was to protect the rights, make sure you have justice and knowledge and progress. These were components. Equality before the law. And government rests on the consent of the governed. Laissez-faire policy, economic policy, such as government hands-off. The government shouldn't be making any regulations. So the roots of liberalism came from John Locke and his inalienable rights theory. You should be free from arbitrary authority, imprisonment, and censorship. You should have freedom of the press. You should have a free right to assemble anywhere, anytime, and there should be a written constitution to govern your government. Advocated direct representation in government for property owners. Now, see, we're not talking about the great masses. So you had connected more to he was connected more to the concept of constitutional monarchy than he was ever to democracy. Citizens needed to demonstrate their investment in their country, their nation, and to do this so by owning property. So here again, we're getting right back, we're talking about property owners getting rights and not you and I who are the workers. Economics and liberalism. Now, Adam Smith, the Scottish economist, wrote Wealth of Nations, in which he attacked mercantilism in the name of free markets. He said the economy should be based on a system of natural liberty. You need to identify the basic economic laws of supply and demand and have a balance of trade. And David Ricardo was a horse of a different color. He wrote on laws of wages and rents. He challenged the idea that the purpose of trade was merely to accumulate gold or silver. He said with a comparative advantage, you argue in favor of industry specialization and free trade. He said, or he suggested, that industry specialization combined with free trade could create international trade and always produce positive results. In fact, he felt that the market price of labor would almost always be, tend toward the minimum required for the subsistence of laborers, reducing as the working population, its wages reducing as the population increases. He believed that this happened only under peculiar conditions. In other words, you're never going to get ahead. The more people you got working, the less money you're going to get, and that's sad. Economic activity ought to be unconstrained, labor contracted freely, property unencumbered by feudal restrictions, goods to circulate freely, and an end to government-run monopolies. The government's responsibility should be to preserve order and protect the property. Well, how does this go along with freedom? That in lands occupied by foreign powers, liberty meant freedom from foreign rule. In Central and Southeastern Europe, the elimination of the feudal privileges, more rights for the local parliaments. In Great Britain, it meant expanding the franchise, laissez-faire economics, and free trade, and creating a limited and efficient government. Jeremy Bentham wrote Principles of Morals and Legislation. He said human interests are not naturally harmonious. Unitarianism says the greatest happiness of the greatest number instead of the greatest happiness for a select few. So how does republicanism and socialism, do they have anything in common? Well, Republicans demanded constitutional and governments by the people. They wanted an expanded franchise and more democratic participation in politics. With socialism, you raise what we call the, quote, social question, unquote, as an urgent political matter. And socialism was seen as, in some ways, a response to such vast industrialization. And of course, the faster the industrialization goes, the quicker the plants go up. And the intensification of your workload, your work miseries, your working class, it's just got horrible conditions. You've got competition, you've got individualism, and you've got private property. And in socialism, they believed that society could be industrial and still be humane. Socialism implies or pushes for government designated for the benefit of society as a whole, whereas liberalism, in contrast, suggests that government was designed for the benefit of the individual, and the society as a whole would prosper as the individual prospers. Well, some of the earliest leaders were Robert Owen, and he built a model workshop at New Lanark in Scotland with the principles of cooperation and not profitability. He organized good housing, sanitation, free schooling, and social security for the people who worked there. But it was a small, utopian-type community. Charles Fourier had the abolition of the wage system. So the division of labor should be based on natural inclinations, with a focus on the agrarian society, more so than on the industrial. You should have complete equality of the sexes. Well, now that's a good idea. Laura Tristan toured France speaking to workers. She touted equality of men and women, which she said people could get under socialism. Louis Bloch campaigned for universal male suffrage. Give the working man control over the state, and the state will become the banker of the poor. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon says, what is property? Property is nothing more than theft. And do you need to remember all these people? No, I don't ask you these people's names. I may use it in a question, but I do not expect you to remember all these names, unless you are major historians. Quadrille dancing at New Landmark. Now, this was the utopian society, and if you look, they've got girls dancing with girls. I don't see guys dancing with girls. It reminds me of the Shakers in eastern Kentucky. They didn't have any contact between the sexes at all, so their community only grew by recruitment. There was no natural increase at all. There was no contact between the males and the females, and when they danced, they never touched. But what about Marxism? Well, Karl Marx, he seemed to be the father of a lot of things. He was influenced by Mr. Hegel's philosophies, and he studied philosophy. He actually wound up becoming a journalist. He worked for the Rheinstadt Zeitung for a while. But he was exiled because of his beliefs and publications to Paris and to Brussels and then finally to London, where he met up with Engels again and became a partner. They got work in the Manchester textile factories, where they wrote a book called The Conditions of the Working Classes in England, which were pretty bad. In 1947, Marx and Engels both joined the League of the Just, later renamed the Communist Party, or Communist League, rather. It was while he was a member of this Communist League that he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. He wrote of history and conflict between employers and the workers. He said capitalism would dig its own grave, and with the collapse of capitalism, the workers would seize the state, and you would have communism and dialectic materialism. Everybody would share. Everybody would have a piece of the pie. I think this is a really short explanation between the difference between communism and socialism. I'm sure it's not another one about the revolutions in Central America. But we'll find out here very shortly.
This might come as a surprise, but in the history of the modern world, there has never been a communist country. While a number of countries have described themselves as communist, for example, China and North Korea, by definition, there has never been a true communist country. So, what exactly is communism, and how does it relate to socialism? Well, it may be easier to explain what the two have in common. Both ideologies originate from a desire to limit worker exploitation and lower or eliminate the influence of economic classes in society. There are dozens of variations on both communism and socialism based on the different ways these ideologies are implemented in different countries. There's Stalinism, Leninism, Trotskyism, Maoism, and others which are essentially all versions of Marxism, coupled with various styles of revolution. Karl Marx was an economist and philosopher who co-wrote the Communist Manifesto, among other foundational books on communism. In short, his theories centered around the idea that as Europe transitioned from centralized monarchies to quasi-democratic capitalist economies, workers were being exploited by those who owned the means of production. So if you work in a factory or on a farm, as many at the time did, whoever owns the factory or farm is getting more out of the worker than they're putting in. This creates an inherent inequality, giving the owners, who Marx called the bourgeoisie, power over the workers, called the proletariat. In Marxism, to fix this inequality, society must shift towards a model where the proletariat hold this power instead, by collectively controlling the means of production. That's where socialism and communism come into play. According to Marx, socialism is a precursor to communism and the next logical step after capitalism. In socialism, a democratic state controls the means of production, rather than having private companies hold ownership. Instead of competing with each other as in a capitalist society, socialism has workers contribute as much as they can to the greater good, and then they all share equally in that good. Variations of this idea are already popular within capitalist societies in the form of universal healthcare or social services like fire departments and schools funded by taxes. While the use of these services is unequal, everyone is equally responsible for contributing to them based on their ability or level of income. So that's socialism. But once the state controls all the means of production, the next step is total collective ownership, not just of production, but all aspects of society and economy, including private property. The intention of abolishing private property is a classless, moneyless, and stateless society, where everyone works towards the same collective goal of being healthy, happy, and free. Everybody does what they can to contribute and takes only what they need in return. As I said before, there are no true communist countries, and there never have been. Every so-called communist country is actually a socialist country, with the state controlling employment and economy to some degree. Even the widely referred to Communist Russia was actually called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In short, socialism and communism are not altogether different. Rather, most schools of economics consider socialism to be a precursor to communism once the state has enough control over society and economy. But this total control is a major reason that socialist countries struggle to reach this ideal. Corruption is rampant in countries like the former USSR, Venezuela, Vietnam, and North Korea, largely due to people in power abusing that power instead of using it to help the society they control, and refusing to give up that power to the people. Nonetheless, socialist ideals have seen incredible success when paired with capitalism in countries like Sweden and Canada. The human hurdle of overcoming power and greed in government is the biggest reason we've never seen a true communist country. So, which countries have been labeled communist, and how do they actually live up to their reputations? Find out in this video to the right. Thanks for watching.
I think we failed to take one thing into consideration here. It's called human nature. If everybody was altruistic, if everybody was good and followed the good book, so to speak, then communism and socialism might work. But there's going to always be one rotten apple in that barrel somewhere. Okay, so let's switch from socialism and communism to nationalism. A nation is from the word nation is from the Latin meaning to be born. The French Revolution defined nation to mean the people or the sovereign people. And he celebrated a new political community, not a territory or ethnicity. So nationalism in the early 19th century is going to lead to, believe it or not, World War I. A nation symbolized legal equality, constitutional government, and an end to feudal privilege, okay? And nationalism is a threat to the local power of aristocratic elites. Yes, it is. But nationalism also can be carried too far, and the British are very nationalistic, as a matter of fact. But what about the liberals in nationalism? They associated it with political transformations, the awakening of the common people. But nationalism could undermine liberalism as well, because it might require the sacrifices of some freedoms, like what they're asking us to do now with the Patriot Act that has been passed because of 9/11. You don't realize how many freedoms that you may not miss right now, but they've been legally taken away from you. So the national identity developed and changed historically. In nationalism in the state, the people are developing national feelings, being proud of their country, being proud of who they are. The economic monarchy, as espoused by the German economist Friedrich List, linking citizens to the state. And the educational system is going to teach a national language. You're going to invent a national heritage if you don't have one. And you're going to do propaganda. You're going to develop a love or feeling for your nation. You'll see this most, I guess you'd say, obvious in the common view after something has happened bad. A bad earthquake or the fires or 9/11. Right after that, everybody ran out and bought flags and it was just singing songs of patriotism. And that is nationalism to the extreme. Talk about the different language groups. We've got every country there has their own language. Even the Balkan nations, each nation has their own language. So let's get away from politics for a few minutes, or can we? Let's get into the cultural end of these revolts going on, and something called the Romanticism, or the Romantic era. Romanticism was really a diverse intellectual and cultural movement. It affected everything from statues to painting to movies to everything. It was a reaction basically against the classicism of the 18th century. Instead of reason and discipline, Romanticism embraced emotion, freedom, and imagination, where the lady could be rescued by a knight in armor on a white horse. The individual and individuality and the subjective experiences. This was romantic. Intuition, emotion, and feelings as the guides to truth. So Romanticism helped fuel growth of love or feeling for nation and nationalism. So, So who were the Romantics? And here we're going to have another series of a lot of names. British Romantic poetry. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. They wrote about the compassion and feelings of binding all men together. So they saw nature as humanity's most trusted teacher, and some of your Native Americans feel the same way. William Blake wrote about the individual imagination and the poetic vision. He was a very fierce critic of the industrial society. Of course, he would be. He said the imagination could awaken human sensibilities. Well, look at children, how imaginative they can be. George Gordon and Lord Byron. Now, Lord Byron's a name you're familiar with. His poetry was the lava of imagination. An aristocrat who rebelled against conformity and inhibition was Lord Byron. His romanticism was inseparable from his liberal politics. And then there was Shelley. He wrote Prometheus is Unbound. He defined a romantic heroism as the cult of individual audacity. I think that's going a little bit too far, but then that's my personal opinion. Here's a name you're going to remember. Mary Goodwin Shelley. She was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, and she wrote Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. And I'm sure we've all read that or seen the movie. George Sand was, of course, a woman who dressed like a man in divine convention, very rebellious against middle-class moral values. Madame de Staël was a German romanist, but she wrote in France as well. Some books in German. She suggested that men could be emotional, and that men and women shared a common human nature. In Britain, John Constable said it's the soul that sees, and he emphasized the artist's individual techniques. J.M.W. Turner, intensely subjective, personal and imaginative, he experimented with brushstrokes and color. In France, Eugene Delerue, new ways of visualizing the world, and he began early modernism in his paintings. The Barb, romantic politics. Somehow that just seems like an oxymoron to me. Romantic politics and liberty, history, and nation, like Victor Hugo. He wrote about the experiences of the common man in Notre Dame and Les Miserables. Francois the Chateau Duran, or the genius of Christianity. He was a very conservative romantic. His religious experience of the national past are woven into the present, with an accent on religious emotion, feeling, and subjectivity. Johann von Herder says civilization arises out of the Volk. Now, Volk is just a German word for common people. In other words, it's coming out of you and me, the normal people, instead of the elites. It says each nation must be true to the spirit or genius of its people. And then you've got the Brothers Grimm. And when I was growing up, it wasn't considered politically incorrect to read us the Grimm's fairy tale, and some of them were pretty crazy. He wrote the Grimm's fairy tales, and he collected German folk tales. Frederick Schiller and William Tell, a rallying cry for German national consciousness. Sir Walter Scott, Adam McKenzie, and you just got all over the place people are writing. So let's get away from the romantic authors for a while. Like I say, I may ask you who you wrote with Frankenstein, but there's just too many of them there, way too many of them. Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798. It's before he took over as emperor. And one of his men found this stone called the Rosetta Stone. And in it was three different languages. One was in Greek, one was in hieroglyphics, and one was in, I was trying to think of the name of the third one. It was also in Egyptian, but it wasn't hieroglyphics. It's in a different language. So they could use the Greek to translate the other two. I'm hoping that's what this is about. And I believe this is our last one, folks, so don't get panicky. Wow, it's only 3 minutes long. Great.
The Rosetta Stone is one of the most famous ancient artifacts in the world. Carved over 2,000 years ago and rediscovered in 1799, the stone is one of the modern world's most tangible links to ancient Egypt. The writing on the stone appears in both Greek and Egyptian, in 3 different scripts. This parallel text helped modern scholars to unlock the secrets of Egyptian hieroglyphics. The earliest Egyptian hieroglyphics were developed over 5,000 years ago, and they became the sacred script used by priests and scribes. Their use flourished in the time of the pharaohs and survived Egypt's rule by the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans, until the Christianization of Rome led to the closing of Egypt's remaining pagan temples in the 6th century CE. The ability to read hieroglyphics was lost for centuries, until members of an expedition to Egypt ordered by Napoleon discovered the granite block covered in writing in the town of Rashid, called Rosetta in the west. The Rosetta Stone proved the key to a mystery some 1,400 years old. But what other secrets does it contain? The stone was carved for Ptolemy V Epiphanes in 196 BCE. Ptolemy V was part of the Greek-speaking Ptolemaic dynasty that was begun after Alexander the Great wrested control of Egypt from Persia in 332 BCE. The first Ptolemy, Ptolemy I Soter, declared himself king in 305 BCE and began a dynasty of many men named Ptolemy and women named Cleopatra, who were often married to each other despite the fact that they were blood relatives. Somehow, that dynasty lasted until the last and most famous Cleopatra. Cleopatra VII and her Roman lover, a general named Mark Antony, lost control of the empire to Mark Antony's rivals in Rome and committed suicide in 30 BCE. You may recognize them from Shakespeare's famous play. But judging by the contents of the Rosetta Stone, there's a reason Shakespeare never wrote a play about Ptolemy V. If you are hoping for the lost wisdom of the ancient world, a scrap of archaic poetry, or dramatic revelations about historical mysteries, I've got some bad news. The Rosetta Stone is something else. It's political propaganda. The stone was a decree issued by a council of Ptolemy V Epiphanes priests to commemorate the anniversary of his reign. It starts by cataloging the king's accomplishments, giving gifts to the temple, lowering some taxes, and ending a rebellion that had started under the previous Ptolemy. After listing these great deeds, the message declares that the Council of Priests will take actions to honor the king, construct some statues, celebrate his birthday, fix up some shrines, basically remind people of his grandeur. The decree ends by stating that it should be inscribed in stone in Egyptian hieroglyphics, another Egyptian script called the Demotic script, and in Greek. That decision, at least, was hugely important, as it was this parallel text that allowed scholars to eventually decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, none of this may be wisdom from the ancient world or lost art by forgotten masters, but in a way, the contents of the Rosetta Stone do serve as another link between the modern world and the past. 2,200 years ago, just like today, politicians love to brag.
I'm sure most of you already knew what the Rosetta Stone was, but just to be on the safe side, that's why I showed it. Because of Napoleon's trip to Egypt, so to speak, it inspired a fascination with ethnography, and new regions of the world. We never really looked at Egypt before. Africa was just a dark continent, and Egypt had the pyramids, but that was about all we knew. We started looking for the roots of Christianity, and we were fascinated with medieval history and religion, especially the Crusades, because that's where all this took place, down in that area. And prior to this time, most of the people of Europe weren't that well educated. Some of the upper class had education and could read books, but we're getting into the time now we have the Gutenberg press, and you've got all this printing of cheaper books are out there, and people are more literate, and they like to read about things, especially about things that's not happening at home. And of course, you got the music. You got Beethoven and Johann Wolfgang, and they're all with the excesses of Romanticism. And Faust sells his soul to the devil in return for eternal youth and universal knowledge. And you got Ludwig van Beethoven, a classicist and a romantic. And he wrote about the glorification of nature and individuality, and the poetry of his instrumental music. His music is beautiful. He was at the center of the Romantic movement, and Goethe and Beethoven are what we call transitional figures, because we're going from Romanticism into another era. So basically, we've learned about the partial success of the Congress of Geneva, trying to find a balance of power and keep France from trying to grow again. You see the rise of tensions between liberalism and conservatism. Liberalism wants to do more for the common people, and conservatives won't. Okay, we'll accept change, but let's do it slow. You got the revolutions in the 1820s and the 1840s that are going to challenge established order throughout Europe and Central and South America. And you've got socialism and Marxism and nationalism and Romanticism. They're all going to impact the thoughts that are going on in people's minds in Europe. So that concludes the lecture for Chapter 20. I thank you, and I apologize again for having doubled up on some things.